The circular economy has come from nowhere in the last 7 years. You have an EU package on the circular economy. You've got the World Economic Forum working hard on that. You've got great expectations from cities and governments. At the recent Helsinki meeting, there were 90 countries and nearly 1,700 delegates in one hall looking at the circular economy over a number of days. This is very exciting. In academia, there are now hundreds of papers and many more expected, and it's entering into the teaching, particularly in business and engineering. I think the question has to be, what is it about the circular economy which is so appealing? I think we have to go back to the basics of what an economy is. It asks three questions, really. It asks us what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets the benefit. It's not only got three questions, it's got three main components. Every economy has flows of materials, flows of energy, and flows of information, particularly money. If you look at the textbook, they have an image almost of a central heating system. You've got two sectors to it, households and firms, capital and labour. Money flows between the two. Wages are paid, goods are produced, income comes back into the firm. That's fairly simple. Add to that, the government takes taxes and pays money out. Add in banks as well. They're intermediaries to make sure that savings are productively put back into the economy as investment. It's very much a pipework, and that's how many people understand it. On top of that, there's a sense of it's going to be in an equilibrium long term. Everything is going to be the best in all possible worlds if the economy runs efficiently. And that's almost the story of the economy. Make it efficient, let it run, it'll sort itself out as long as you don't get in the way. Drozny is an early systems thinker, and Drozny wanted to characterize an existing economy and the problems with it. And the main problem he identified was there was no context. This economy was running as a sort of machine sitting on top of stocks and flows of resources and energy. It only touched it where it had to. But what I mean by that is that it wasn't factored in. There was no costing of the resource in a true sense. There was no costing of the waste in a true sense. It was artificially priced. Everything had price, but they didn't really understand the value, is what he was saying. So you needed to contextualize the economy and look at resources and material flows.
Let's pause for a moment and think.
Joel Drozny came up with the macroscope, which is the idea of dropping detail. We have a microscope to look at the detail, we have a telescope to look at distance. His idea was if we took a macroscope, if we took a big picture view, we could get a sense of the patterns in the economy without worrying about the detail. That's really very, very helpful, because if the problem with the economy was that it hasn't got a context, a macroscope allows you to say, where does an economy sit? Oh, it sits within society, obviously, it sits within environment, and all of these things are intimately interconnected because they're part of a system which isn't mechanical. It's actually dynamic, interdependent. It reflects what we now understand about how the real world works. And the real world works through the notion of complex adaptive systems, which just means a very dynamic system where you can't predict the outcome, but you have lots of patterns that show up. And you can use the patterns to tell you what you might like to do. But it doesn't offer you an answer in the way having an economy as a machine with levers would give you an answer. There's no long-run equilibrium in a complex adaptive economy. It might be here, it might be there, it might be doing very well, it might be poor, but there's no assumption that it's going to all work out. If only you're efficient, that to Drozny would be an incredibly naive view. And that's been the really big challenge for a lot of people. Economics, for some it's been a journey from the mechanistic view to a more enlightened complexity economics view. But the general view of the economy is still of a machine that processes resources, creates economic growth, and oh, it's a shame we've got these problems at the other end. And it's a shame that we might be running into resource scarcity. Whereas if you see it as one complex adaptive system, you can then work within these patterns, these flows. The existing economy talks about just throughput. It degrades capital and runs the system through it. How much can you get through? You're a winner. Whereas a complex adaptive system would say, there's a stock, there's a flow, there's feedback. If it's going to work long term, all of these three components have to work in an interdependent way and continue working. And so that's a very different question about how you do something with an economy like that. You participate in it, you influence it, but you don't control it in that sense. And equally though, you can't promise people that it will all turn out fine if only they behave in a certain way. It just doesn't. That's not how the real world works. Now, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that because they want to be able to promise the people, the politicians want to promise an outcome that's great. You know, everything has to be better in the future because we control the machine and it will be.
No wonder everybody's acting so nervous.
But if it's not a machine, it's more like a forest, if you like. You're not going to predict what the forest does. It's full of so many actors, so many players with so many influences. It's a bit like a gardener coming along and saying, I want this plant to grow quicker, and pulling on the top of it to see if it would grow faster. You can't do that. You have to set the conditions for the forest, for the garden, and you can choose where you plant it. You might do a bit of editing. But you can't say, this will be the output. This will be the result. You've got to see how it goes. If that isn't working, adjust it a bit. And that requires a bit of humility. And for some people, they absolutely hate the idea that we might not be totally in control of this. They just don't want to admit it because they feel that they lose their power if they can't promise X amount of growth in a number of years or this much output. So there is a real tension between seeing us being in charge of the economy and us being an actor or a participant in the economy. And that difference of perspective is really, really central. And it spread through right into the notion of the circular economy. For some people, the circular economy is saying, okay, we've got this circular flow of income and expenditure. How do we add in materials to this? Let's add the material flows into there because we'd like it to cycle continuously. But that's more about the pipework. It's saying we don't want the leaks, we don't want waste, we want to design out waste, but we want to make sure there isn't any waste, that we can keep control of the flow. And if we say move from people owning things to accessing them, we can keep control of these big durables like cars or houses or whatever and just say, if you want access, you pay. And that means we can use resources much more economically, much more effectively. And this is sort of selling products as a service or selling access. This really might help with the economic question about resources because you're slowing the flow of resources through the system and you're looping it back. So you slow the flow, complete the loop. But the question then is, you've added materials into the pipework? Who benefits from that? Now, if this adding materials into the pipework means we could lower prices to people, if we could make things more available at lower cost, people would then have more money to spend. And then that would cause economic growth and jobs would increase. Many people in the modern world are not experiencing increases in income. So this would be a great idea. It helps save resources and lowers costs. But if their income is falling as well, this means that they're only just hanging on a bit longer. So that's how a great idea like a circular economy, if it's seen as a pipework, can actually have only a partial effect, one that people would rather was better, because some of the other system conditions haven't been changed.
Will you stop honking, Mac? We ain't going nowhere.
The other view of a circular economy is it's more like a forest, if you like. There are lots of leaky loops. Now, what I mean by leaky loops is anything that comes into a firm and goes out is food. It's useful, it's not contaminated, it's not problematical. People know what it is. And if people know what material is, and it's clean in that sense, it's not going to harm them, they come and find a way of using it as a way of increasing their economic activity. It's very much like the forest floor. All sorts of material falls on the forest floor, and billions of creatures come and treat that as food. The only rule, it seems, in the forest is that what falls to the forest floor is pretty much okay to eat by something. And this means that the circular economy is one where you can build prosperity from the base up because you've got much more material, it's much more accessible. You're not determining exactly how it's used, but you're just keeping to some fairly simple rules. Everything should be food for the system, whether that's the biosphere or the technical side of things where we make products, so that it comes back. When you think about the difference in perception, there's a very big difference between trying to eliminate waste in a pipework to stop it leaking and then maintain control, and the other one with Janine Benyus, she's a writer in what's called biomimicry. She says, be generous, because that's what happens in living systems. It's a lesson from living systems. Be generous. Why? Because to feed the trees, you feed the forest. Michael Braungart said many years ago, he's a designer and chemist who worked on the idea of cradle to cradle, the design philosophy which underlies a lot of circular economy thinking. He used to tell the story, and I think he still does, of the cherry tree. Why all this blossom in spring? You don't need that many cherries to reproduce that tree over, say, 25 years. So why be so wasteful? But that's not a question, even if a tree could answer it, that it would answer. The tree produces blossom because, it needs to reproduce itself, but whatever is chucked on the floor, is blown by the wind, is food for the system. And so that tree doesn't get fed by its own falling blossom. That's nonsense. That's absolutely, really dumb thinking. How could you imagine it would work that way? Why should it work that way with businesses? If you're in a business ecosystem, everybody should be able to feed from each other because it lifts the overall level of prosperity. This is, really effective systems 101. To have an effective system, things must circulate. If it doesn't circulate, it doesn't work. Adam Smith was talking about that hundreds of years ago, the great circulation. He was insisting that the biggest problem that we had in the economy then, that there wasn't a free market. And he meant that it wasn't free from people who did nothing but got money. It was the landlords in those days. We needed a free market to enable more exchange, more circulation, if you like, of wealth. So that's really modern science updating aspects of what Adam Smith was saying. In other words, you need the right system conditions to make sure you can maximize exchange, and the right system conditions to make sure that anybody interfering in the market has limited power, because if they have too much power, they extract rather than circulate. Doug Rushkoff's very good on this. He says the question before us is whether we extract value or circulate it. And an effective system is built on the idea of circulation, whereas an efficient one might be very good at stopping leaks from the pipe, but it's not really saying, is everybody getting a fair shake of this? It's a bit like the tree puts a little boundary around itself and says, those are my leaves. I'm keeping all the nutrients in those leaves, but then forgets that they need more than those nutrients. If it was a firm, they need customers. And that's a big argument. Where does the income from a firm come from? It comes from customers. Customers need to be well off. You need a middle class to buy the products. And yes, we hope the products are designed in the right way. But if you don't have customers with money, you're in trouble. So you might fix the resources question all you like, But if the customers don't have the money to buy goods and services, what have you achieved, actually? And this is back to that systems perspective. A systems perspective says we need to optimize the system so that those actors in the system have every opportunity to improve their own prosperity, and by doing so, improve the prosperity of everybody else. Now, that might sound so obvious as to why on earth do we say it, but it's actually not the way the world's working at the moment. It tends to be very extractive. The potential to allow businesses and people to create their own prosperity is sometimes rather limited because they don't have access to resources. There isn't necessarily an abundance of resources, because one of the great ways of making additional earnings is to make things scarce. Make it scarce, and people can then have to pay a high price, or a higher price than they should do. Nothing wrong with price per se. But paying a higher price might mean that there's scarcity. Some people can't afford to buy into it. So the big question in the different views of circular economy is that it's a great idea. We need to circulate materials, and we need to move towards renewable energies. But we also have to think, what sort of circulation is it that we're building? Is it more like Janine Benyus is talking about, create an effective ecosystem which is based on circulation? Or is it more like the pipework, which is drawing in the materials cycle to the existing economy? And this is quite a nice teaser in a way for many people. Is it about the economy and fixing up the resources bit? Or does it point towards transforming the economy into a really different sort of economy, based much more on insights from living systems? Is it about optimizing the whole system, or is it about making sure you've got really good resource efficiency alongside labor productivity, but nothing much else is changing? If you optimize the whole system, it's the analogy I've already mentioned, or the notion of, if you want to have big trees in a forest, you need to feed the forest. You don't just directly feed the tree. You know, a vibrant system helps all of the participants in that system. You need a healthy soil. You need lots of detritivores, things that degrade things. You need fungi, insects. For every human in the world, there are something like 1.2 billion insects. You know, if we have a real idea of the pyramid of living systems, we would be amazed. And I think we ignore that at our peril with the economy, because it is those people, all of those billions of people that we've got, they're all productive. They're all potential consumers and producers, but they need a way of participating in the economy. That's the different perspective. How do you enable people to be productive in a system which is regenerative, accessible, and abundant? At the moment, we're more focused on the pipework analogy, but significant numbers of people are saying, well, actually, this other perspective has got lots of richness to it. It's got lots of potential. If the question is, in the end, what is an economy? We have to answer the three questions, or not us. Economics has to answer that question, which I started with, which was, what do we produce? How do we produce it? And who gets the benefit? You can't answer that economic question by just saying, how do you produce it?